The trail climbed gradually, never steep enough to slow them, but persistent enough to keep their breathing measured. Dirt packed hard beneath their boots, broken occasionally by exposed stone where runoff had stripped the path down to its base. The forest pressed in on both sides, tall pines rising straight and close, their upper branches lost beyond the line of sight. Light filtered through unevenly, shifting as the wind moved the canopy above. They walked without order. John drifted ahead, then slowed. Mark fell back, adjusting his strap. Brian moved between them, positions changing without comment as the trail allowed. The sounds of movement, fabric brushing, boots scuffing loose gravel, filled the space where conversation might have been. Nothing about the hike demanded discussion. The trail was familiar enough to let the silence hold. John slowed near a bend where water had carved shallow grooves across the path. He stepped over them without stopping, eyes tracking the ground briefly before lifting again. The route was clear, dry, exactly as expected for that time of year. The trees opened slightly around the stretch of exposed rock, and it was there they passed someone coming the opposite way. The man moved with the same pace they had settled into. He stepped aside before anyone spoke, boots finding purchase near the edge of the trail without hesitation. His clothes were practical, dark fabric faded by use, not neglect, and carried the faint smell of smoke and damp earth. A low hat shadowed his face. He nodded once as they approached. A greeting passed between them, quiet and indistinct, more habit than intention. The exchange lasted only long enough for their paths to cross. Footsteps faded behind them almost immediately, absorbed by the forest and replaced by the familiar sounds of their own movement. The trail straightened again, narrowing as the trees closed back in. Sunlight fractured across the ground, broken into shifting patches that offered no consistent direction. At the overlook, they stopped for a water break and to adjust their packs. The pause felt ordinary, necessary. From there, the trail stretched back the way they had come, unchanged in any way that mattered. When they turned and started down, the brief encounter already sat somewhere behind them, unexamined and intact, carried forward only by the fact that it had occurred at all. The walk back down took less time than the climb, the trail easing just enough to let their steps fall into a steadier rhythm. The light had shifted while they were gone, angled lower now, stretching shadows across the path in uneven bands. John stayed a few steps ahead, moving the way he always did outdoors. Not fast, not careful, just certain. He'd been coming to this stretch of forest for years, long before either of them had joined him. The route, the campsite, even the timing of the trip were familiar choices, repeated because they worked. This wasn't a trip built around challenge or discovery. No one was trying to prove anything. They came here because it required little explanation, a short break from everything else, something that fit cleanly into a weekend without leaving a mark. As the trail leveled out, conversation came and went in pieces. Small remarks, dropped observations, never settling long enough to matter. The forest thinned ahead, the familiar shape of the clearing beginning to take form through the trees. From a distance, the campsite looked the same as it had that morning. The fire ring was cold, a thin layer of ash settled at the bottom. Packs lay where they'd been dropped. Nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of movement beyond what they'd left behind. John set his pack down near the edge of the fire and rolled his shoulders once, working out the tightness from the hike. Mark moved toward the cooler, already thinking ahead. Brian lingered near the fire ring, scanning the ground out of habit more than concern. It wasn't until John went to grab his water bottle that he paused. The bottle wasn't where he'd left it. Not missing, just relocated. Set a few feet away, upright instead of on its side. Close enough to feel deliberate, far enough to be wrong. He stood there a moment, eyes moving across the site, checking positions. Everything else remained in place. Nothing had been taken, nothing broken. John picked the bottle up and said nothing. They continued unloading. Gear shifted, food came out. The motions of setting up camp took over, smoothing the interruption without fully erasing it. They worked through the rest of the setup without urgency. The tent went up quickly, muscle memory doing most of the work. Someone misjudged a steak and corrected it. A joke landed and passed. The small movements of camp filled the space the hike had left behind. John moved back toward the fire ring and set the water bottle down beside his pack. He hesitated, then glanced once more around the clearing, checking positions. Nothing else appeared out of place. "Did either of you move my bottle?" he asked, his tone neutral. Mark looked up from the cooler. "No." Brian shook his head. "Why?" "Thought I left it over there," John said. "Maybe you didn't," Mark replied. He didn't sound convinced or unconvinced, just finished with his thought. John let it drop. There was no reason not to. A few minutes later, Brian struck a match and dropped it into the fire. The flame caught slowly, licking at old ash before settling into a low burn. Smoke drifted briefly through the clearing before thinning out. "That guy on the trail," Mark said without looking up. "He come from the overlook?" John paused, then answered, "Opposite direction." Brian asked, "What guy?" "The one we passed," Mark said, "before the rock cut." John looked between them. "You don't remember?" Brian shook his head, slower this time. "No." Mark straightened. "You nodded at him." Brian opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked past them toward the trees, as if expecting the trail to be visible from where he sat. "I don't remember anyone," he said. The fire popped once, sending a brief scatter of sparks upward. No one rushed to fill the quiet. John shrugged. "Probably just another group heading out." Mark nodded easily. Brian hesitated, then did the same. The conversation drifted elsewhere. Food, plans for the morning, whether the temperature would drop overnight. Laughter came once, then again. The sound sitting briefly in the clearing before fading. The bottle stayed where John set it. Nothing else moved. The fire settled into a steady burn as the light faded from the clearing. The forest dimmed gradually, colors flattening into darker versions of themselves until only shape and distance remained. Brian added a log without comment. Sparks lifted briefly, then disappeared. They ate a simple meal on overturned packs and low rocks. Conversation drifted the way it always did. Work mentioned and dropped. A half-told story that never found an ending. Silence filling the gaps without feeling forced. Nothing about the evening pushed for attention. When it grew colder, John stood and moved toward the tree line, checking the perimeter of the site out of habit more than concern. The woods beyond the clearing were quiet, the kind of quiet that came from nothing happening, rather than something waiting. Mark followed him for a few steps, stopping near the edge. "You sure this is the same spot?" he asked, not looking directly at anything in particular. John nodded. Same one. Mark didn't argue. He just stood there a moment longer, eyes tracing the ground before turning back toward the fire. Brian stayed seated, hands resting on his knees. "Did you guys set the packs like that earlier?" he asked. John looked back at their site. The packs sat where they'd been dropped, but one of them had been shifted slightly, angled away from the fire instead of toward it. "I don't remember," John said. Mark shrugged. "Could have bumped it." "Yeah," Brian said, though he didn't move to adjust it. The fire cracked softly. Night settled further, pressing in without changing anything. Later, when the temperature dropped, they moved closer together, instinct drawing them toward the heat. Someone reached for a bottle and paused before picking it up, then continued as if the hesitation had been nothing. No one mentioned the man from the trail again, or the water bottle. But when the conversation drifted toward morning, how early to break camp, which way to head back, John noticed something small and persistent beneath the talk. They were planning around an extra margin of time. Not much, just enough to register. He didn't say anything. The fire burned down to embers. The clearing held its shape. The forest remained still. Sometime during the night, John woke without knowing why. The fire had collapsed into a low scatter of embers, no longer giving off heat, only a faint red glow. The clearing was still. Mark and Brian slept on, their breathing steady and unchanged. John checked his watch. The time made him pause, not because it was late, because it wasn't. He turned his wrist slightly, angling the face toward the faint light, then checked again. He'd expected the night to be further along, enough that the difference felt noticeable. He lay there for a moment, doing the math without finishing it. The fire, the cold, the way the night felt settled. Eventually he told himself he'd woken up earlier than he thought. That happens sometimes. He rolled onto his side and closed his eyes. By morning, the moment had already dulled, remembered more as a feeling than a fact. Morning came with thin light filtering through the trees, the forest shifting from shape to detail as the air warmed. The fire had burned itself down to ash. Condensation clung to the tent walls. Nothing appeared disturbed. They broke camp without hurry. Packs were open and closed, straps tightened, gear folded back into certain places. The routine moved easily. The plan was unchanged. Head back the way they'd come, reach the trailhead before midday, drive home before the afternoon slipped away. John checked his watch while loading his pack, then checked it again. Mark noticed. "What?" John hesitated. "Nothing, just... I thought it'd be later." Mark glanced at the light coming through the trees. "Feels about right." "Yeah," John said, though he didn't sound convinced. He looked back down at the watch, then at the clearing, as if lining the two up might settle something. "Yesterday took longer than I expected." "The hike?" Brian asked. John nodded. "From when we left camp to when we got back, I kept thinking about it last night." "We stopped a few times," Mark said. "I know. I accounted for that. He ran the route back through his head. The climb, the overlook, the walk down. Nothing stood out. No stretches that dragged. No delays that made sense of the difference he felt. Brian shifted his pack higher on his shoulders. Could have just felt longer. Maybe, John said. The word didn't close the thought. So what, Mark asked. You think we lost time? John exhaled softly. I don't know. I just don't like that I can't make it add up. Mark didn't push it. Does it change anything? John looked at the trail, then back at them. No. That seemed to settle it. They started down, falling into the same loose spacing as before. The path was clear, the ground firm. The forest opened and closed around them without resistance. Still, John found himself checking the light more often than he needed to, gauging its position against where he expected it to be. The trail offered no explanation. It simply went on. They reached the junction just after midday. The trail widened slightly, splitting around a shallow rise of packed dirt and stone. One path continued straight, the other bent off to the right. A small wooden marker stood nearby, weathered but legible. John stopped. This way, he said, nodding right. No, Mark said. It's straight. John turned. No, it isn't. Brian studied the marker. It was straight when we came in. We didn't come in this way, John said. Yes, we did, Mark said. Brian nodded in agreement. Their disagreement didn't feel emotional. It felt mechanical. John stepped onto the right-hand trail. This is the way back. That leads deeper in, Mark said. Brian stood between the paths, looking from one onto the other. How long were we walking after the overlook, he asked. Not long, John said. Long enough, Mark replied. I'm not turning around, said John. Neither am I. They both looked at Brian. He stepped backward, choosing the straight path. I'll catch up, he said. John didn't argue with him. He started down the right-hand trail. Behind him, footsteps moved in another direction. The forest closed around him evenly. The trail held. After a few minutes, the sounds behind him faded completely. The trail continued on. John stopped once, just long enough to look back. The trail behind him looked no different than it had before. Empty, uninterrupted, offering no sign that anyone had chosen another way. After a moment, he faced forward again and resumed walking, leaving the question untested.